What if the man wearing the white robe was not a shepherd of souls, but a predator in silk? What if the holiest throne in Christendom became a seat of murder, lust, and greed? Tonight, we step into the shadows of the Vatican. We uncover the men who turned the papacy into a weapon and a scandal. Some were tyrants. Some were killers. Some sold salvation like cheap wine. So before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. Hit that like button if you're ready to see history as it really was, raw, dark, and unforgettable. Because these are not saints. These are the worst popes in history. He was barely 18 years old when they placed the papal crown upon his head, a boy named Octavianus, thrust into the holiest office by a dying father who saw the papacy not as a calling, but as a family inheritance. Rome watched, perhaps with hope, perhaps with suspicion. But no one could have predicted what would follow. The young pope who took the name John XII did not kneel in prayer. He did not seek counsel from saints. Instead, he looked upon the Lateran Palace, the very heart of Christendom, and saw only a playground waiting to be defiled. Imagine the whispers that must have echoed through those marble halls. Sacred chambers, once filled with the scent of incense, now played host to wine-soaked banquets and women brought in from the streets of Rome. The holy relics that pilgrims had traveled for hundreds of miles to venerate were quietly pawned off, their gold melted down to fund pleasures that bishops dared not speak aloud. At night, the palace glowed with torchlight as dice clattered across tables and laughter mingled with the clink of goblets. Some said the Pope himself would toast to pagan gods, raising his cup to Jupiter while the city's most notorious courtesans danced where cardinals once knelt. But John's reign was not merely a festival of indulgence, it was a slow unraveling of power itself. He alienated the one ally who could have protected him, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. When Otto learned that the young Pope had secretly been negotiating with his enemies, his fury was absolute. He marched on Rome, not with the zeal of a crusader, but with the cold precision of a man who had been betrayed. What followed was a spectacle even more shocking than the debauchery. A synod convened to put a sitting pope on trial. Bishops who had once looked away now came forward, their testimonies painting a portrait of a young man who had committed simony, murder, incest, and, according to some, even invoked demons. John was deposed. But he was not finished. With the help of a Roman mob loyal to his family, he clawed his way back to power, and the vengeance he exacted was swift and brutal. Enemies were mutilated. Bishops who had spoken against him were executed. And then, just as suddenly as he had returned, his life ended in a moment that seemed almost designed to mock the very office he had held. A jealous husband, it was said, struck him down while he was still tangled in the sheets of adultery. Or perhaps it was a stroke that claimed him, a fitting end for a man who had spent his brief reign chasing pleasure until his body could take no more. Pope John XII did not merely stain the papacy. He dragged it into the mud, laughed while it suffocated, and left behind a vacancy that would soon be filled by men who had learned from his excess, but who would push corruption to even darker heights. For what John began in sin, the next pope would perfect in greed. And yet, as the echoes of John XII's disgrace faded into the dust of Rome, another figure was already waiting in the wings, a man whose corruption would make the teenage pope seem almost amateur by comparison. His name was Theophylactus, born into the Tusculan family, a dynasty that treated the papacy not as a sacred trust but as a family business, passed from father to son like a vineyard or a palace. When he took the throne as Pope Benedict IX, he was barely older than John had been, but his ambition was sharper, his appetite for power far more enduring. He would become the only man in history to wear the papal crown not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, and in doing so, he would turn the highest office in Christendom into something that had never been seen before, a commodity bought and sold like any other earthly possession. The chroniclers of the time wrote of his reign with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They accused him of rape, of adultery, of summoning dark powers that no man of God should even name. It was said that wild orgies unfolded within the Vatican's own walls, that the scent of incense was replaced by the smell of wine and something far more profane. The Roman people, who had tolerated much from their popes, eventually drove him from the city in rebellion. But Benedict was not a man who accepted defeat. He returned, then left again, then returned again, each time clinging to power with the desperation of a man who knew no other life. And then, in a move that stunned even the most cynical observers, he did something no pope had ever dared. He approached his godfather, a priest named John XII, and offered to sell him the papacy, for a price. Gold changed hands, and Benedict walked away, leaving the throne to Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI. The transaction was so brazen, so utterly devoid of spiritual pretense, that it sent shockwaves through Europe. But Benedict had no intention of staying gone. He returned to Rome, reclaimed his title, and suddenly the Church found itself with 3 men each claiming to be the true Pope. The Holy Roman Emperor was forced to intervene, calling a council that stripped all 3 of legitimacy. Benedict was excommunicated, not once, but multiple times, as he continued to scheme and maneuver. He was a man who treated the throne of St. Peter like a game of musical chairs, a pope for sale, a soul auction to the highest bidder. And though his schemes eventually faded into the obscurity he so richly deserved, the image he left behind was indelible, a pontiff who looked upon the keys of heaven and saw only the glint of gold. From such twisted ambition, the papacy would soon descend into an age even darker, one where the line between sacred power and brutal violence would vanish altogether. And from such twisted ambition, the papacy would soon descend into an age even darker, one where the line between sacred power and brutal violence would vanish altogether. It was an age that bore a single name, whispered across Europe with a mixture of fear and fascination: Borgia. When Rodrigo Borgia secured the papacy in 1492, he did not ascend through holiness or humility. He bought his way into the highest office in Christendom, his gold greasing the palms of cardinals who looked the other way as the conclave turned into a marketplace. Crowned Pope Alexander VI, he did not see the Vatican as a sanctuary. He saw it as a fortress for his dynasty, a throne from which he could elevate his children to power, marry them into kingdoms, and crush anyone who dared stand in his path. The Pope who should have been a shepherd became a spider, and the web he wove stretched across Italy. His son, Cesare, was a cardinal who traded his robes for armor, a man whose name became synonymous with cold-blooded ambition. His daughter, Lucrezia, was handed from one political marriage to another, her reputation forever stained by rumors, some true, some invented, of incest and poison. Within the Vatican walls, Alexander presided over spectacles that defied the imagination. There was the infamous banquet of chestnuts, where 50 prostitutes were brought to the papal palace to entertain the assembled guests, the Pope himself watching from his throne as dancers shed their garments and coins were tossed to see who could catch them in ways that made bishops cover their eyes. Sacred chambers echoed with laughter and the clink of goblets, while outside, the faithful prayed to a god whose earthly representative seemed to have forgotten his name. Yet Alexander's corruption was not merely personal indulgence. He turned the church itself into an engine of profit, selling cardinals' hats to the highest bidders, granting favors to those who paid the most, transforming the curia into a den of bribery and backroom deals. The Pope who should have been a guardian of souls became a merchant of holy office, and beneath his reign, the foundations of the church began to crack. He died in 1503, his body swelling so grotesquely that it would not fit into its coffin, a fitting end for a man whose legacy was rot wrapped in silk. But the poison he left behind would linger for generations, spreading through the Vatican like a sickness. And yet, even as the Borgia name became a byword for decadence, there was already another scandal waiting in the shadows, one so bizarre, so macabre, that it would make the orgies of Alexander seem almost quaint in comparison. And yet, even as the Borgia name became a byword for decadence, there was already another scandal waiting in the shadows, one so bizarre, so macabre, that it would make the orgies of Alexander seem almost quaint in comparison. It began not with gold or women, but with a corpse. The year was 897, and Rome was a city fractured by rival factions, each vying for control of the papacy. Into this chaos stepped Pope Stephen VI, a man placed in power by a family hungry for revenge against his predecessor, a man named Formosus. But there was one problem. Formosus was already dead, buried nearly a year before Stephen ever took the throne. That small detail, however, did not stop Stephen, for he had devised a trial unlike any the world had ever seen. The order was given, the tomb was opened, and the decomposing body of Pope Formosus was dragged from its resting place, dressed in full papal regalia, and seated upon a throne in the Lateran Basilica. What followed was a grotesque parody of justice. A deacon was assigned to speak for the corpse, answering the charges Stephen hurled from across the chamber while the audience looked on in stunned horror. The body, bloated and beginning to decay, slumped and swayed as the trial wore on, its desiccated fingers clutching the robes that had once signified holiness. Stephen accused Formosus of perjury, of violating canon law, of unlawfully seizing the papacy. And in the end, the corpse was declared guilty. The papal vestments were stripped away. The 3 fingers used for blessings were severed, and the body was dragged through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Tiber River, where it drifted out of sight like refuse. But Stephen had miscalculated. The public was not awed by his display of power. They were revolted. Riots erupted across the city, and within months, Stephen found himself imprisoned in a cell where his enemies came for him with cold efficiency. They strangled him, ending his reign as brutally as it had begun. In the years that followed, the Church would try to bury the memory of the Cadaver Synod, reburying Formosus with honor and nullifying the proceedings. But the image remained, seared into history like a scar that would not fade: a dead pope on trial, a living pope destroyed by his own cruelty, and a sacred office reduced to a theatre of the absurd. And yet, even after such grotesque spectacle, the darkest chapter of papal history had only just begun to unfold.